After 15 years of marriage, Sarah dressed up for a night out with her lover. She whispered to her husband, Mark, "I need to feel young and free again tonight." Little did she know, Mark had already packed her bags and changed all the locks on the doors. Her lover's wife was waiting at a restaurant with divorce papers for both of them. When Sarah said she needed to feel young and wild again, Mark knew it wasn't about him. What she didn't realize was that he was about to turn her perfect night into her worst nightmare. These chilling words come from Mark, a dedicated contractor and loving husband from a quiet town in Ohio. For 15 years, Mark and his wife Sarah had built a seemingly perfect life together, raising 2 children, sharing laughter over family dinners, and working through the ups and downs of marriage. But recently, something had changed. Sarah, once warm and predictable, became distant and secretive. Late nights at work, quiet phone calls, and the glow of her phone screen at strange hours began to replace the intimacy they once shared. Mark noticed these changes right away. He had always prided himself on being attentive, but his questions were met with vague answers and deflections. As cracks started to show in their relationship, Mark's mind raced with possibilities. Was she unhappy? Was he losing her? Still, he stayed silent, choosing to ignore his doubts rather than risk a confrontation. He told himself it was just a rough patch, something they would get through, like they always had. But what he didn't know was that Sarah's desire to feel young and free again would lead them both into a collision with betrayal, heartbreak, and an unexpected twist that would change their lives forever. After noticing subtle cracks in his marriage, Mark's suspicions grew as Sarah's behavior became increasingly unusual. She spent long hours on her phone, often smiling at messages she never shared. She started dressing up more often, without offering any clear reason. These seemingly small changes weighed heavily on Mark. But it wasn't until he overheard a suspicious phone call that he felt truly alarmed. Though the words were unclear, the tone was unmistakably intimate. Later, Mark caught a glimpse of a flirtatious message on Sarah's phone, confirming his worst fears. Unable to confront her directly, Mark's anxiety began to spiral. He decided to quietly observe her behavior, making mental notes of her new habits. Frequent errands that lasted longer than expected, unexplained absences, and hours of unaccounted time. Each new observation deepened his unease, pushing him further into a world of doubt and fear. The more he watched, the clearer it became that something was very wrong. Mark felt he had no choice but to take matters into his own hands. The stage was set for Mark to uncover the truth, no matter what the cost. His suspicions were building to the point of an inevitable confrontation. Sitting alone in their living room, Mark reflected on the 15 years of marriage and the family they had built together. The heartbreak was crushing, but amidst the pain, Mark resolved to stay calm and act with precision. Instead of confronting Sarah immediately, he decided to approach the situation strategically. He knew a rash confrontation would only lead to more chaos. It was during this time of clarity that Mark made an unexpected discovery. The man Sarah was seeing was married. This revelation gave him an idea. Rather than expose Sarah on his own, he decided to contact the man's wife. Mark reasoned that coordinating with her could ensure both women got the truth they deserved, while also holding Sarah and her lover accountable for their actions. With a plan forming in his mind, Mark moved forward, determined to confront the betrayal head-on, but with control and precision. His heartbreak had transformed into a quiet resolve as he prepared for the confrontation that would change everything. Once the truth of Sarah's affair was confirmed, Mark quietly began preparing for the confrontation. He waited for the perfect moment. The evening Sarah was preoccupied getting ready for her supposed date. While she spent hours upstairs preparing, unaware of what was coming, Mark methodically put his plan into motion. First, he gathered Sarah's belongings, packing them neatly into suitcases and setting them by the front door. Each item he packed felt like a final farewell to the life they once had. They had built a life together. Next, Mark changed all the locks in the house, making sure that when Sarah returned, it would no longer feel like home. Each turn of the lock echoed with the quiet resolve he had found to protect himself and their children from further betrayal. With the house prepared for her absence, Mark took the boldest step of his plan. He contacted the wife of Sarah's lover. Speaking to her was both surreal and cathartic as he discovered that she, too, had suspected her husband's infidelity. Together, they agreed to meet at the restaurant where their spouses had planned to rendezvous. United in their shared goal of exposing the betrayal, Mark found a strange calm settling over him as the minutes ticked by. He reflected on how the heartbreak and fury that once consumed him had given way to a steely determination. He knew the fallout would be messy, but there was a sense of closure in taking control of the situation. With the final pieces of his plan in place, Mark steeled himself for the confrontation that awaited, ready to face the truth head-on and reclaim his dignity in the process. The fateful night finally arrived, and Sarah was full of anticipation, unaware of the storm brewing around her. She spent hours preparing, meticulously dressing in a way Mark hadn't seen in years. Her excitement was palpable, though she masked it under vague explanations about an event she claimed to be attending. Just as she was about to leave, she turned to Mark and, with a sly smile, whispered, "I need to feel young and wild again tonight." The words stung like a final blow to his heart, but Mark remained composed, giving her nothing in return but a silent, knowing glance. As the door closed behind her, Mark stood motionless, watching through the window as she drove away, his mind flooded with memories of their life together, the laughter, the struggles, and the love they once shared. He reflected on how everything they had built over 15 years had unraveled in the blink of an eye. Despite the sorrow threatening to consume him, Mark steadied himself. He knew there was no turning back now. Meanwhile, at the restaurant, the carefully laid plan began to unfold. Sarah's lover arrived first, expecting a romantic evening, but was met instead by his furious wife. She held divorce papers in her hand, her voice rising as she demanded answers. The scene quickly drew attention from onlookers, creating a tense, humiliating spectacle. Moments later, Sarah walked in, excitement on her face, until she saw what was unfolding in front of her. She froze in shock, her carefully curated image of the evening shattered in an instant as she took in the sight of her lover being confronted by his wife. The reality of her choices began to sink in. The night Sarah had envisioned had turned into a public disaster, and she was left standing at the center of the chaos. As the night unfolded, Mark's plan continued to play out with precision. Back at the house, Mark waited in silence, knowing Sarah would soon return to find her belongings by the door and the locks changed. Sure enough, her frantic calls began, each one more desperate than the last. She pleaded through voicemails and texts, alternating between explanations, apologies, and attempts to manipulate him into opening the door. But Mark remained resolute. He ignored every attempt, his focus now solely on moving forward and reclaiming the life she had torn apart. Meanwhile, at the restaurant, chaos reigned as the confrontation escalated. Sarah's lover's wife, armed with evidence and years of pent-up frustration, took control of the scene. She didn't just expose her husband's affair. She made sure both cheaters were publicly humiliated. She confronted Sarah directly, calling out her betrayal and dismantling any excuses with cold, hard facts. The restaurant patrons watched in stunned silence, their whispers adding to the weight of the moment. For Mark, hearing about the fallout brought a sense of closure. Sarah and her lover were forced to face the consequences of their actions, not just privately, but in the glaring light of public judgment. The cracks in Mark's life that once felt overwhelming now seemed like opportunities to rebuild stronger foundations. The fallout, though painful, marked the beginning of a new chapter for him, one without lies, betrayal, or the person who had shattered his trust. This section bridges the confrontation to its emotional aftermath, showing both Mark's strength and the full repercussions of the betrayal while maintaining the narrative flow. As the dust settled, Mark took a moment to reflect on the whirlwind of events that had led him to this point. Exposing Sarah's betrayal wasn't just an act of retaliation. It was a way to reclaim his dignity and find closure in a situation that had threatened to consume him. Though the pain of losing 15 years of marriage still lingered, Mark found solace in knowing he had taken control of his life rather than letting the betrayal define him. He acknowledged that facing the truth had been one of the hardest things he'd ever done, but it also became a turning point. Looking back, Mark realized that while betrayal had broken the foundation of his marriage, it had also set him free to rebuild his life on stronger terms. With quiet determination, he resolved to focus on healing, moving forward, and finding a sense of peace that had been missing for far too long. His final message resonated deeply. Sometimes the hardest truths lead to the strongest resolutions. Betrayal may break you, but it also sets you free. As the story concluded, Mark turned to the audience, inviting them to reflect on his journey. What would you have done in my situation? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories like this. With this call to action, Mark's story transitioned from personal reflection to a shared experience, leaving the audience with a sense of closure and a lingering question to ponder. Thank you for being a part of this story with me. If it moved you, please give the video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to Narrative Stories. I've noticed many of you who enjoy these stories aren't subscribed yet. By subscribing, you're not just following a channel. You're becoming part of a community that values deep, meaningful storytelling. Let's continue exploring these heartfelt journeys together. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.